instead turn it over right now to Congresswoman Dingell for opening remarks. Congresswoman?
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks to everybody for being here today. This is a really important conversation we're having on domestic violence. It's an issue that I care deeply about. My co-chairs all feel deeply about. Each of us, unfortunately, has our own story. And now more than ever, we must recommit ourselves to ending this threat of domestic violence and ensuring survivors have the support that they need. These last 2 years have been really tough. Thanks to the Futures Without Violence for hosting this event and to my fellow co-chairs for their longstanding efforts. The working group was established in 2018 to unite a bipartisan group of members and stakeholders who are dedicated to ending domestic violence and strengthening the resources for survivors and their children. The group hosts quarterly meetings where experts explore the varied policy implications of domestic violence and how Congress can craft legislative improvements for survivors and prevention programs for future generations. If your bosses want to join, we'd love to have them. Reach out to my office. What is special about this group is that we represent a spectrum of political views, and yet we all care very deeply and equally about protecting survivors of domestic abuse. Today, we're going to discuss one aspect of this tough issue that is too often overlooked: supportive services for perpetrators of violence. We will hear from a panel of experts who will shed light on recent studies, strategies, and programs that are being used across the nation to help abusive partners stop their violent behavior. Addressing domestic violence at its core is a critical component to eliminating it entirely, and these intervention strategies just may offer a new way to achieve this goal. I'm glad we're together to continue this important work. Thanks all of you for being here. And I apologize that the members may not be able to be on for the whole conversation because we are going to have votes shortly. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Dingell, and for your true championship around these issues. Congresswoman Young Kim, would you like to say a few remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten, and everyone who is joining this very, very important event. I know co-chair, Congresswoman Dingell just mentioned the importance of bringing all of us together to have an important dialogue and this roundtable to have a conversation on abusive partner interventions. As you know, nearly 20 people are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States every single minute. That adds up to more than 10 million women and men each year. And unfortunately, the impacts of domestic violence on victims were made worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. So our communities deserve to live free from violence. And when we are safe at home, we are empowered to succeed at school, at work, and in life in general. We must do more to prevent violence before it starts and to intervene and support victims if it occurs. So I'm grateful to our participants here today for their work, and I look forward to learning how Congress can help address domestic violence in a bipartisan way. Because I know working together, we can put an end to domestic violence. So thank you so much for all of you for doing your part and for participating. And as Congresswoman Dingell mentioned, I will be signing off to go vote, but our team will be staying on to listen and listen to the very important dialogue that is taking place today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Representative Kim, for being here. And I really appreciate your words that together we really can end domestic violence. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Congresswoman Lesko for your remarks. Congresswoman Lesko, are you available? Okay. It looks like perhaps she needed to step away. Congresswoman Lesko, if you are there, please let us know, and we will, of course, pause the moment you're available. With that, let me conclude these remarks and turn it over to my colleague, Juan Carlos Arion, who will be leading us through this conversation today. Thank you.
Okay, now you should be able to hear me. Thank you so much, Kirsten, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Juan Carlos Arian. I use pronouns he and él, and I'm a program director at Futures Without Violence, and I'm so excited that this event has finally arrived. As of this moment, we have over 650 people in the room, so clearly there is a lot of interest on this topic at this point. I want to start by welcoming everybody and expressing my gratitude to the Bipartisan Working Group to End Domestic Violence, co-chaired by Representatives Singal, Kim Moore, and Lesko. And thank you so much for your excellent opening remarks. You really help set the stage for this important conversation. I also want to thank our presenters today and their organizations for donating their time for this event. I will be introducing them by name and affiliation when it's their turn to speak. You can find their full bios in the chat. My colleague Lana is going to put in the chat now. We're also grateful to other co-sponsoring organizations for this roundtable: the Center for Court Innovation, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, the National Coalition for Shared Safety, the National Compadres Network, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And special thanks to my colleagues at Futures Without Violence who have worked so hard to make this event possible: DJ Pei, Claire Cow, Lana Davis, and Kirsten Stewart. The abusive partner intervention field, also known as battering or batter's intervention, has changed significantly in the last few years. There is new research focusing on different aspects of the interventions, showing promising results, and importantly, being informed by the voices of survivors. There are emerging and established practices that show great promise in working with people who use violence. Some of these practices include survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally relevant approaches that elevate racial equity and self-reflection as crucial to this work. You will hear today about some of these approaches, and you can learn more about them from the guiding principles for engagement and intervention with people who cause harm, developed by the Center for Court Innovation, Futures Without Violence, and some of the organizations which will present at this event. You can download this document from the chat. Again, Lana will put it there now and probably later again. Thank you so much. There is one thing that has not changed through the decades. Many survivors, not all, but many, continue to ask for help for their abusive partners and for their children's fathers. We must always centralize the voices of survivors when we discuss practice, policy, and research in this field. And before I invite our speakers to share their knowledge, I want us all to remember that interventions for abusive partners and initiatives that support adult and child survivors share the same goal. Every member of the family and of society has the right to safety, well-being, and healing. I would like to open the roundtable by inviting Ruth Glenn, the CEO and President of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, to join me.
Thank you, Juan.
Hi, Ruth. Good to see you. Thank you for being here. So, Ruth, you bring several perspectives to the table. As an advocate for many years, a policy leader, and a survivor. From any of those perspectives, why do you think abusive partner interventions is important?
So thank you so much to Futures and the bipartisan group for putting this together, because we don't talk about it often enough, quite frankly, from all three of those perspectives. That's where I'm coming from. it's important for what you first outlined, which is that everyone has a right to be healthy and safe. And survivors come to that with, can you assist me in helping it stop? Just want it to stop. There's a misnomer that victims and survivors are no longer caring about the person that's hurting them, that they're no longer in love. And that is just not true. And so just asking them to leave versus doing what we can to help someone who's hurting someone else is not always the answer. In fact, most of the time it's not the answer. I will also say, as a survivor, I don't know that I would have chose any way specifically, but I do know that I didn't feel like there were people out there that could help us while I was enduring that. And then thirdly, this is a part of our nation that, a policy and nation that really is a little bit frustrating, quite frankly, is that in order to prevent in domestic violence, we've got to prevent domestic violence. And if we're not addressing those who cause harm at the root of what their issues are in some kind of standard way, some kind of concrete way, we're going to see that continue. So as a nation, I don't believe that we put enough to prevention. And abusive persons who want power and control, if they can't maintain it with somebody else, they're going to go on to someone else. If they can't maintain it with their primary victim at that time, they will go on to someone else. So what do we do to prevent that from happening? And not just with that currently abusive person, but through the continuum of services that we might be able to provide in our schools and all of that. So those are my kind of three perspectives on that.
Thank you so much, Ruth. We really appreciate you setting the table here for the conversation. Thank you. Next, I would like to welcome Ethiondo, the Executive Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment. Hello, Ethiondo.
Hello, Juan Carlos. Thank you very much. And thanks to the Congressional Bipartisan Working Group on Domestic Violence for the opportunity to be part of this important and historical congressional briefing. As you know, over the past 2 decades, many community leaders, researchers have argued for an increased recognition and support of abusive partners intervention programs, also known as batterer intervention programs. We have argued that abusive intervention programs are an important part and perhaps the most neglected part of our evolving systemic response to intimate partner abuse. I'm excited about this initiative that Futures is engaging and take it as a sign of commitment at the highest levels of government to strengthen our systemic response to intimate partner violence. Now, the issue that you want me to address is the effectiveness of the programs. Are they effective? I jumped the gun in that.
So that's okay.
That's the question.
That is the question.
That is the question. And it is important for me that people know to understand that it's important when talking about the effectiveness of abusive intervention programs to understand that these programs are a small part of a broader systemic response designed to curb and eliminate the use of violence and abuse in intimate relationships. This system includes legal interventions, such as arrest policies and protective orders, judicial oversight, as well as coordinated community network responses designed to increase the efficacy of the system and further reduce IPV recidivism. The data is clear, and it showed that each level of intervention is making modest and important contributions to stop and reduce violent behavior by abusive partners. Protective orders are an effective form of violence deterrent for more than 1/2 of the men. Approximately 2/3 of all men arrested for domestic violence offenses do not reassault within 6 months. Now, we know that intervention programs for men who batter began to emerge slowly in the late 70s and significantly increased in number following the criminalization of domestic violence in the 1980s. By 2014, we have estimated that there were over 2,500 battery intervention programs across the nation serving about 1 million men per year. Since the 80s, there have been over 60 published program evaluations looking at the effectiveness of battery intervention programs in preventing reassaults. The summaries of individual outcome studies consistently report lower rates of reassault by men who complete intervention programs. Reviews of quasi-experimental evaluations have found intervention programs to prevent reassault for about half to 2/3 of participants who complete the programs when compared to non-completers. They have also found that about 20% of the men in the programs continuously reassault. There is also evidence from et al.'s multi-site longitudinal study, as well as from other studies, that coordinated community response networks can significantly enhance the efficacy of various interventions and further reduce IPV recidivism. As Gondol has noted in some of his writings, quote, program effectiveness depends substantially on the intervention system of which the program is a part. Now, at odds with this kind of like narrative and these findings, in the late 1990s and 2000s, meta-analysis of battery intervention programs and some experimental studies put into question this assertion and suggested that the reported rates of reassault in these studies had little or no program effect. The broad consensus, however, among researchers has been that methodological shortcomings compromised most of these studies and limited the validity of their conclusions. In recent years, however, there has been a new wave of meta-analysis by research teams in the US and Europe, suggesting that battery intervention programs make significant contributions to the prevention of reassault in intimate partner relationships. Together, these analyses are important because they include a larger pool of control studies and new studies with hybrid approaches to treatment that have been produced since earlier meta-analyses were conducted. Included in this new group of studies are evaluations of programs designed to better address comorbidity issues, such as substance abuse and trauma, and high dropout rates known to affect the effectiveness of battery intervention programs. In 2019, Xin-Jin Chen and her colleagues reviewed 14 studies, including treated and untreated comparison groups. The results indicated that battery intervention participants were about 3 times less likely to have domestic violence recidivism and about 2.5 times less likely to have general offense recidivism compared to non-treated control comparison group. Also in 2019, Teresa Gannon and her colleagues looked at 14 domestic violence studies of intervention programs led by professionals, psychologists. They found that intervention programs are effective in reducing violence for male perpetrators of IPV, comparing post and pre-intervention, and reported a relative reduction of 36% for domestic violence programs. The same year, Gunnar Karakork and her colleagues evaluated 17 outcome studies with pre and post data, and they said, quote, our examination of full and pre-post data from 17 studies indicated that intervention programs that are designed for male perpetrators are an effective way to reduce violence at post-test. When conducted exploratory subgroup analysis, we found that treatment approaches incorporating substance abuse and trauma yielded better results. Although different intervention methods were not significantly better when compared with each other, quote, pre-post studies which used augmented substance abuse and trauma yielded better results in reducing the violence of perpetrators. And finally, just a few months ago, in 2021, Aine Travers and her colleagues looked at 31 outcome studies to evaluate the types of interventions being used to prevent IPV recidivism from the last decade, and to assess evidence for interventions situated in what they call a risk-need responsivity framework in comparison to the more one-size-fits-all approach. Their analysis showed that RNA-informed programs demonstrated effect sizes suggesting potential reductions in recidivism of 65% to 79%. For studies with follow-ups of a year or less, studies with follow-up of 13 to 24 months also demonstrated positive effect of treatment. The analysis of longer follow-ups did not demonstrate effectiveness. In closing, then, a new analysis of the effectiveness of battery intervention programs appear to be more in line with what we have found and we have learned over time from many battery intervention programs and quasi-experimental studies. The new research helps us appreciate the limitations of their earlier wave of meta-analysis and help us construct a more accurate narrative about the effectiveness of battery intervention programs. More importantly, they highlight that innovative efforts taking place in the field to better respond to the multiple needs of abusive partners attending intervention programs and the positive impact of these efforts in preventing reassault. Thank you.
Ethiondo, thank you so much, and congratulations on covering so much ground in 5 minutes. We're very, very appreciative for that, and we will make these studies, at least the citations, available for folks. So I'll pass it back to Kirsten for a sec.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. And I did just want to welcome Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, who we introduced earlier. She is now able to join us, and as a reminder, she's one of the co-chairs of the working group and has been a long time advocate for ending domestic violence in terms of her legislation and her outspokenness in Congress. Congressman Lesko, would you have a few comments for us?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to the group. I represent about 765,000 constituents in the Phoenix metropolitan area in Arizona. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for the work that you do, not only to help the victims and survivors of domestic violence, but to also help reduce recidivism amongst the perpetrators. I am a survivor of domestic violence. My ex-husband, who I left about now 29 years ago, was very abusive, often threatened to kill me and steal my young daughter. And so I have lived this. I got an order of protection when I finally got up the courage to leave. My ex-husband, he tracked me down and showed up while the movers were moving my furniture and such into my apartment. And I had to scream out and tell people, the movers, to call the police. Thank goodness the police showed up. As you know, it's a very difficult time for people to leave their abusive perpetrator, because that is the time when most likely the victim could be killed. And that happened, that was the case with me. So it was hard to leave. So I'm glad that all of you are working, like I said, not only to support the victims, because quite frankly, it was very difficult for me. I would call those domestic violence hotlines, but then I wouldn't go to a shelter myself. And I always tried to cover up for my ex-husband. And I have no idea to this date why I stayed with him. But I think it's a common theme, and people are surprised that haven't experienced it, just how prevalent domestic violence is. Usually when I speak to groups, I usually always have women that come up to me after the meeting and say, "Oh, thank you for talking about this. This happened to me." As you know, because you're in the business, it's very prevalent, and these victims need help. But the perpetrators, if you can reduce the recidivism of it, that would be fantastic. Now, with my ex-husband, I quite honestly don't think that would have been possible. It's just his character. After I left him, he did it to other women. And so it's a very difficult problem. And I applaud you for everything you do, and let me know how I can help.
Congresswoman Lesko, thank you so much. Every time I hear you speak, I am just further touched and further appreciative of your willingness to share your story. And I know, as you know, that it means so much to those of us who do the work in the field, but also to the survivors who hear you. So thank you again, and we will definitely look forward to working with you moving forward.
Well, I look forward to it too. And unfortunately, I have to go vote. I think they just rang the bell for me to go vote. So I have to go to the floor. But thank you again.
We understand. Thank you. Juan
Thank you.
Carlos, may I pass it back to you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for making the time and for the deep sharing that has happening both for Congresswoman and Ruth Glenn. Personal stories are always so important to be part of this conversation. And speaking of personal stories, now we would like to present a short video from the Alma Center in Milwaukee. It will bring into the room the voice of Jamie, a person who has both experience and used violence. Lily, please, if we could have the video.
Thing I liked about it was because when I came, I got to be myself. It wasn't like I better watch what I say. Man, I can't really open up because if I open up, they might use this against me. You know, she allowed me, and the thing that really like was a turning point for me. I was there, I don't know how long, but I was pissed off I was mad about something, and it was just like I don't care. Like, believe me, I don't care about going to the joint. Like, the prison system was basically my life, because at an early age, me personally, I knew I was going to prison. Probably before I knew I was going to graduate or become anything in life, I knew I was going to prison. It was just a matter for what and for how long. That's it. You know, so then she came and she basically was, I was hot-headed. I was like, I don't care, I'll go back to jail. She was like, Jamie, you know, I just read your file. And I'm like, what you mean? I was there by him for like a month. I've been through hell with him. I've been in jail with him, came back to him and everything, but she was like, I just read your file. She was like, I didn't read your file till just now, and then like, the stuff you done been through and what I see totally different. What's written on paper and what's how you really is. And that's one thing I think like a lot of programs and a lot of like the DOCs have issues with, because when we're young, they write a file on you. And that carries on for you. That I could have done something when I was 15, I'm 30 years old. They will open up that file and read it and judge me. Then they think they know me. So then I would tell them, well, what's my favorite color? Since you think you know me so much, tell me my favorite color. Tell me what I wanted to do when I was a shorty. I had dreams too. What was my dreams? You can't tell me that, but you could tell me I smoked weed at 13. You could tell me I was a bandit. You could tell me I got in a fight. You can tell me I got shot, but you can't tell me nothing positive about myself, but you think you know me. And with that, it was different because she didn't open up a file to read on me. She got to know me first as a person. And that right there was like just a changing point, because when she told me that, I was just thrown back. Like I said, so you just read my file now? Like literally, seriously? She's like, yeah. And that right there was just like, wow, it was just something like she got to know me and didn't judge me on my file. And even when she did read my file, it wasn't no difference.
Thank you so much, Lily. And now I would like to welcome Terry Strothoff, the founder and executive director of the Alma Center. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Juan Carlos.
Terry, that's such a moving video. I always get choked up when he talks about like, you think you know me, so what are my dreams and what's my favorite color? And I know that you have continued to work with Jamie, and I know that when he talks about she did that and she said that, and that she is you. So I would like to ask you, tell us more about what's the Alma Center's approach in working with people like Jamie?
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and it's just a really pleasure to be here. And I wish that Jamie could be here with us today too, but he cannot. He is working, but he wants me to tell you that he's honored and he's proud, and frankly, he's like blown away that his words and story are being heard at a congressional briefing, and that they may have touched any of you here. They've certainly touched me. I've been asked to talk about a trauma-informed, healing-focused approach to abusive person intervention programs. And I want to start my remarks at the very beginning of that. I ask you to take a second. You just saw Jamie at 30, and just imagine him as a newborn baby, just popped into the world. And if not Jamie, just imagine an infant that you've held, that you've loved. And I ask that you call to mind what you've experienced looking into the innocent face of a newborn. At the Alma Center, we believe that all of us are born whole, loving, lovable, capable, worthy, enough, that nobody comes into this world with the intent or the purpose to grow up and to cause harm to the people in their family, the person they love, their intimate partner. But yet the men who come to us are indeed causing harm to those they love and acting in ways so completely disconnected from the essential wholeness into which they were born. So we have to ask ourselves, what happened? What happened in the development of this baby, in the growth of this child, to disconnect them from the truth of who they are? And truly, how you answer this question will determine what kind of intervention, program, and services you will support, you will design, and you will implement. At the Alma Center, we answer this question from the perspective of human development and from the science of trauma. And the science teaches us that when a baby lands in an unsafe, unprotected, chaotic, stressful environment, when where the baby's core developmental needs like attunement and attentiveness and valuing and nurturing are not met, when there's no safe relational container for them to feel, to express their emotions, their brain, body, and nervous system develop in response to these experiences of toxic stress and adversity. That happens for boys, for girls, non-binary, white, black, and brown. It happens for all of us. For all of us, our worldview, our self-concept, and our habitual ways of acting, our behaviors develop in response to our environment. And if we land in an unprotected, unsafe environment, we have to figure out how to cope with it, how to survive the pain and the real and present danger of these experiences. We're all hardwired for survival. It's normal human development, and it represents brilliant resiliency, not pathology. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. From the science of trauma comes the understanding that any dysfunctional, challenging, harmful behavior toward others, such as those behaviors which get people referred to our programs, all of our programs here, began as a coping mechanism, as a way to deal with the pain of not being safe, protected, seen, held, attuned, valued, or cared for in the ways needed by human beings to support our healthy development. Many boys and men tried to protect themselves from this pain by donning the armor of toxic masculinity, most especially BIPOC men and boys who are also trying to cope with and survive the daily painful realities of systemic racism and oppression. Science teaches us that changing these behaviors is not as simple as learning new attitudes, values, and skills. Trauma is a wound of development rooted in emotional pain, lodged within our brain, body, and nervous system. And if we don't resolve the pain and its impacts, then when the pain is activated, when it's triggered, and it will be, we will respond with our habitual survival-based coping mechanism. Resolving trauma requires healing. And what happened to the men in their childhood, it's not their fault, nor are they to blame for their trauma. At the same time, trauma is not an excuse for adult behavior. No one else outside ourselves is responsible for how a person thinks, acts, or feels in the present. No one makes another person act abusively. The men are responsible for their own choices. At any point in time, at any time, they can choose to heal, transform, evolve. And as a trauma-informed and healing-focused agency at the Alma Center, we believe it's our job to support men in the journey of healing and transformation to become cycle breakers. And abundant research in trauma science demonstrates this approach is evidence-informed, and our practical experience tells us it is the right fit to the realities of people's lives. So thank you so much for listening to Jamie and for allowing me the time to share our experiences here.
Thank you so much for sharing, Terry, and for your wonderful work.
Thank you.
So I'd like to invite next Martini Keefe, the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Project in Minneapolis. Hello, Martini. So the Domestic Abuse Project is one of the few programs, maybe the only program I know, that explicitly incorporates a racial equity framework. Why is it important, and how do you do it?
Thank you. So I think as providers, it's really important for us to recognize that while we are working with folks that have caused harm, we also have the capacity to be harm doers. And in the context of our role, we hold a lot of power in the outcome of our participants' lives. So for example, when we dismiss someone from programming, let's say for too many absences, historically, we haven't always considered what that might mean for that participant, for their victim, in regards to access to their children, their socioeconomic environment or needs, or their longevity and engagement in the systems that they're already a part of. Nor have we taken into consideration the systemic racial and historical inequities that might have led to that pattern of absences. In reality, we have a profound impact on keeping folks on the path to rehabilitation by considering all of these things, or risk reinforcing a path of punishment. Once we really valued equality, the reality is that there's two things. The first is that our racial bias impacts our application of processes that are intended to be equal. And second, by acknowledging historical, racial, and systemic oppression, we can now see that equality is not always equitable, and it diminishes the realities of what our participants experienced before coming to our program, as Terry and Jamie beautifully highlighted, what they are currently struggling with, and their ability to be successful in being nonviolent once they're done with our programs. So doing race equity work, as well as focusing on bias and inequity around other identities, is the accountability work that as providers, we're morally and ethically obligated to do. I think in regards to how we do this work at the Domestic Abuse Project, our race equity framework really mirrors our intervention and prevention program. So it's a cycle of learning about racism, acknowledging our history of racism, our ability to be racist, as well as the harm that we may have caused, and practicing making anti-racist choices and engaging in anti-racist actions. It's then re-acknowledging and recommitting to that process over and over again. Our framework calls for active participation from all members of our team, from our board and our staff, to our interns and our volunteers, to our funders and our community partners. And it doesn't continue to flourish if we walk away. It requires attention, and it requires continuing to challenge what our notion of equity actually is, assessing whether or not we are in fact being equitable, being open to failure and to talking about it, which we're not always great at, and incorporating language, processes, and actionable steps into every part of our organization, from how we answer the phone, to our hiring practices, to how we consult about cases, to how we invest our organization's resources. And it also needs to be something that can survive funding crises, political shifts, and staffing changes. So the way that we've attempted to do this is by being a values-driven organization. And doing all of this work is our way of breaking our personal intergenerational cycle of violence that, similarly to our participants, took us a lifetime to build and is going to take us a lifetime of daily commitments and anti-racist choices and actions to break.
Wow. Thank you so much for that sharing, and thank you for your work. It's so needed in our field, especially right now. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Next is Jeremy Deville Sorrell, Director of the National Native Coalition of Men's Programs, which is part of a program called Wicha Agli. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello.
So Jeremy, Wicha Agli and the National Coalition work in Native American communities across the country. Why is it important to place culture at the center of these interventions?
Culture is a big thing. You know, it's culture that creates the climate of that, you know, produces barriers, but also using culture as a way of dealing with the violence. You know, when we go back to traditional ways working in Native communities, we are pulling that back and say, how are we drawing this back, and how are we going to utilize these traditional practices, right? We know long ago in our creation stories and throughout our histories and our values that we teach a lot of things around balance, respect, egalitarian concepts, everything there. Everyone had balance, right? We have the 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. We have the 4 ages: infant, adolescent, adult, elder. We have the same concepts around having balance with self, family, community, and society, and they're all linked together. And so those values and those teachings guide us. They guide us in our ways of child rearing and interacting with one another, and how we shape and look out for community. And now through the process of colonization and over the years with boarding schools, the forced assimilation, and the acculturation, these practices that came through, we lost a lot of connection with that in our raising people in this way and having these values. So when we start to look at it now, people talk about recidivism, how we study the effectiveness of batterers intervention, and we're like, evidence-based practice is one of these things that pigeonholes people into one way of doing things. So we shifted around for not forcing ourselves and say, what's an evidence-based practice, right? Everyone wants, the only way they can really measure batterers intervention for the most part is by recidivism, right? But it's so hard to measure attitudinal change because what are the actual measures you can change? Now, I've always said for a number of years now, like I would like the attitude in our communities to be accepting of change of a batterer's behavior the same way we accept the change of an alcoholic's behavior. We know people are going to fall off the wagon many, many times, and it took decades before AA was considered a viable, acceptable option. And we allow people to fall off the wagon and to change it. We don't blame AA anymore, but we do over here with abusive partner intervention and battery intervention programs. But I want that mindset to be there in the way that we organize to be there, to say that we are undoing a lifelong learning. Like we're not going to do it in 52 weeks. The average group is an hour and a half. So you're talking about 80 hours of time, right? 85 hours of time to undo 40 years of learning. That's not realistic. But how do we create a community and society that supports that person and supports that way of being? And so going back to our practice-based evidence, right? We got our traditions, not evidence-based practice, practice-based evidence. We know through our histories that we didn't have this level of violence. It's in our culture, it's in our language, it's the way we do things. And we want to be able to bring that back and add that into the way that we're doing our work. And many programs across the country are doing in Native communities. And the one example I want to share with everyone is just in our language, to be Ojibwe, right? When you break down the word Ojibwe, the O refers to the spirit, the J-I refers to the self, and Bwe is to breathe, right? So when I'm being Ojibwe and I'm raised in a culture way to act Ojibwe and be Ojibwe, it's not to my identify as me in this territory in the woodlands, northern Minnesota area. It's to me act like a spirit breathing. And that's the root of our teachings, right? It's like, so to act Ojibwe, we have translations of words, we treat each other as relative. Everyone is a relative. Mm-hmm. So to act Ojibwe and to treat each other as Ojibwe, it's to treat each other as a spirit breathing. That's inherent in our culture, and all of our communities have those type of teachings. And we're employing that back to say, how do we change our communities and influence individuals and bring that mindset and thinking there back into the way we do our work, into a way that we are supposed to act as men in community and society.
That's brilliant, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your participation. And one thing, every time that I talk to you, or the few people that do really culturally specific work with abuse partners intervention, is that I invite our white allies to look at these cultural specific programs not as exceptions to the rule, but as possible guides. It's easy to dismiss like, well, that works for Native American folks, but not for mainstream folks. But there's so much that we have to learn from cultural specific programs. So I really, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Mark Philpart, the Managing Director at Policy Link. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Juan Carlos. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you're here. You lead the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color in California, and you have been exploring abusive partner interventions outside the criminal legal system, which is so necessary and so different from the way that most people do their work. So can you tell us more about the work and why is it crucial at this moment in history?
Sure, absolutely. And just as background, the work that I do with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color is really grounded in policy advocacy. We're an advocacy network of more than 200 organizations working to transform systems that fail boys and men of color and their families. We strive to advance self-determination and create communities full of opportunity. And for many of the members of the network, including myself, violence is something that we have deep familiarity with. When I look at my own family history, when my mother was 8, her mom, my grandmother, was brutally killed by an estranged lover in Los Angeles while waiting in an unemployment line. The events that led to the tragic circumstances, the lack of support my mother received thereafter, the challenges she faced in her own relationships are a direct result of failed systems. And other men within our network have similar stories. I have a few quotes just to summarize some of those briefly. My earliest memory at the age of 3 was witnessing my father brutally attacking my mother. The violence that was produced in my home, I reproduced in the streets as a youth. Another said, my dad went to prison for domestic violence multiple times. It only made the violence worse. These perspectives shaped our understanding of violence as not only learned behavior, but deeply and intimately connected to other forms of violence and oppression, including patriarchy and misogyny, colonization, state violence, and the structural racism, which disproportionately creates poverty and the marginalization of communities of color. We believe that the path to safety and healthy relationships is built through community-based interventions that are healing-centered and grounded in our cultures, our assets, and racial and gender equity. So taking those learnings and principles, we launched a campaign called Healing Together in October of 2019. And for us, a central theme of that campaign was that healing happens in relationship to other people and in community. Healing from violence doesn't happen in isolation, yet this is the most common approach to interventions that our systems deploy, specifically the criminal legal system. We had over 90 organizations join us, a combination of domestic violence organizations, gender justice orgs, racial justice orgs, all coming together to advance solutions that prioritize healing, safety, and accountability, all within the kind of community-centered framework, not punishment. We're holding a vision for a survivor-centered system that's guided by abolitionist values and an unrelenting belief that people have the capacity to heal if supported. So our Healing Together partners have collaborated on a number of different fronts, developing tools to support capacity building and organizations' ability to engage men in work to end patriarchal violence and further healing. But also on the policy front too. Last year, the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and Healing Together partners were successful in passing the Crisis Act. The Crisis Act will provide millions of dollars to community-based organizations for non-police responses to intimate partner violence and other emergencies. Healing Together partners in Los Angeles, Dignity and Power Now, they're advancing a pilot program in collaboration with LA County that'll support survivors and individuals facing charges and getting the community-based services they need to be safe and healthy. That pilot is now being introduced as state policy, authored by Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, AB 1670. In Contra Costa County, another county in the Bay Area, our partners at the Rise Center, a local youth center, and Stand for Families Free of Violence, a local domestic violence organization, were part of the early development of the Collective Healing and Transformation Project, which is community-based domestic violence intervention program that's outside of the criminal legal system and engages the whole family through restorative justice as a safe alternative response to violence. And we've been working with the first US helpline for people who are harming a partner, 10 to 10, out of Massachusetts, to replicate that resource in California. These efforts are just a few examples of the groundswell of interest in shifting approaches to end partner violence. But we desperately need to grow support for these types of efforts. We need increased investment from the federal government for this type of innovative, community-centered, culturally rooted and grounded healing oriented approach to supporting survivors that engages whole families, including men and people who've caused harm. Right now, states and local communities are doing this work largely on their own. And the opportunity really is for the federal government to step in a big way. I'm excited to talk about this in more detail, and am thankful for the opportunity to share some of our work with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Very, very inspiring work, and one that we need to emulate in different spaces and start thinking outside the box of systems. So I appreciate you being here. And last but not least, in terms of our speakers, I would like to invite Pam Weissman, the Executive Director of the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Hello, Pam.
Hello, Juan.
So, Pam, in the US, New Mexico has been at the forefront of supporting local APIPs. Can you share with us the rationale behind this advocacy, including seeking funding from the state?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Boy, all these really inspirational speakers, and I'm talking about money. So forgive me, but I'm going to do that anyway. I guess we have to do that sometimes. So thanks to the Bipartisan Working Group, and especially Futures, for giving us this chance to talk about battering intervention. And I also want to thank you just for giving me the chance, if you don't mind, to recognize our New Mexico battering intervention programs who are doing really great work. Don't very often get acknowledged, but really need to be. So thank you to all of you who might be on this call. Thank you to our funder, Children, Youth, and Families Department, known as CYFD, to the governor of New Mexico, and to our legislature for a commitment to funding these programs. New Mexico gets funds from the general state revenue. There is also a fund into which fines and fees that are imposed on people for various crimes are deposited for a variety of reasons, which I know we all understand. That fund has declined a lot, and we expect that decline to continue, and eventually it may be gone. So our funding will all be state revenue. Fortunately, this year we requested, and we hope that we are in fact going to get a pretty large increase in general revenue funding for BIPs. Maybe it could be as much. What we asked for was 100% increase over the previous year. So it will be a sizable amount of money for our state, and that money is administered by CYFD. There are 38 programs that are accredited, meaning, as in most places, that referrals can be given. 24 of those funded BIPs, or 24 of those battering intervention programs are funded, and 20 of them, fully 20 of them, are dual service, meaning they offer both survivor and BIP services in one agency. And I don't know this, so therefore I'll say it. I think that the level of expertise and a coordination when you have battering intervention and survivor services together may be part of the reason that we have been receiving funding for so many years. I think funders like it, and I think it really helps us to keep survivor issues really at the forefront. Why else would they fund us, and what have we said in the hopes to get funding? And the first is what's already been said here a number of times. I believe our state knows that survivors want battering intervention, and that and there is some research, I'm not sure if Ethiondo mentioned it or not, that survivors feel safer and better off when their partners are in a BIP. And BIPs also provide accountability. And that's important because without it, there really often is no change. But BIPs are not accountability like punishment, and they aren't jail. They're a really good alternative to incarceration, which is important to people in our state. So they provide a consequence, and hopefully it is a helpful one that will give people an opportunity to do something different. And I also just want to mention that battering intervention programs often can play a really important role in their communities, educating their communities about domestic violence in general. And that can be very effective. And in New Mexico this year, a little under $500,000 additional was designated by our legislator to support that sort of community education and that sort of thing. And last, in the very few seconds that I know remain here, I just want to say that, BIP has been, it's been on the sidelines, and people have been doing their great work with not much fanfare, not much visibility. And so I want to thank Futures for attempting to do something about that. And somehow I think the stars were perhaps aligned, because just as this was being sort of discussed, we also began the first ever national BIP network. And it's made up of experts in the field. It's the best and the brightest. And we already have 46 states involved. And that's after just one meeting. And Futures is, of course, a part of that. Juan Carlos is a part of that group. And I hope that this coalition has the potential to give us some structure, direction, ideas. And I'm convinced that it can be a really powerful force in this sort of reinvigorated effort, I guess, to bring battering intervention to the front and center, where they have long needed to be and have been not as successful as it appears they may be now. So thank you to Futures and to everyone who is here presenting, and to the people on the call for making this forward movement possible.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Pam, and the amazing leadership that you're providing. And I do feel that things are changing, and more states are looking at the possibility of funding for programs. And I also want to emphasize what you said, because sometimes when people hear trauma-informed or culture-specific or different words like that, they feel like we're letting people off the hook. And that's not true at all. We're talking about a different way of thinking about accountability. As you said, is not punishment. It involves consequences, because bad behavior had consequences, but it also involves support for change. And those things can go hand in hand. And that's what we're talking about here. Yeah. So I realize we're at the top of the hour, and I'm glad that everybody got time to share what they had to share. So what I would like to do now is just briefly share some of the policy recommendations that we have as a group, not only Futures, but everybody here, including our co-sponsoring organizations. And then if people can stay, we can go to some of the questions that were put out there. So some of the federal policy recommendations from this group, and we will be sending this out to everyone, includes make funding available for abusive partner intervention, including culturally specific programming, by adding it as an allowable use to the Violence Against Women Act STOP grant and improving criminal justice system responses program. Also integrate funding for APIPs into other efforts to reduce community and family violence, including through the President's Community Violence Intervention Initiative. Repurpose portions of the Responsible Fatherhood Grant Program and Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act funds to reduce domestic violence and improve child outcomes by developing and expanding programs for abusive men and fathers. Supporting training and technical assistance to responsible fatherhood programs to educate fathers about domestic violence, understand its impact on children, and connect fathers to resources if they are survivors of violence or if they use violence in their intimate relationships. Establish a national helpline for abusive partners, or work with the existing national domestic violence hotline to expand available service for abusive partners. And create and fund a new grant program for initiatives that work with abusive partners, adopting a survivor-centered, trauma-responsive, culturally relevant framework, including both systemic and relational responses to change abusive behavior and promote healing. So thank you very much, everybody that has stayed for the full hour. And if you are leaving now, have a good evening. And let's spend a few minutes. I know that there are a few questions in the question and answer. Lana, do you want to share with us?
Yes, what a great conversation. Thank you to everyone. If you haven't been following the chat, I just want to say to the speakers, take a look. There's so much love for you. And if you're interested, a lot of people are asking for your contact information. So if you're willing to be contacted, maybe just put your email in the chat. So yeah, there's a few questions. One is regarding sort of trauma-informed programming. One of the participants is asking the question, what's the difference in programming when you're helping a trauma survivor versus a trauma survivor who also uses violence? Is there any difference?
Who would like to take that one? You can raise your hand on the raise hand function, if you will, or you can unmute yourself and talk. Or I can assign someone. Terry, go for it.
Sorry, I was trying to find the raise hand. I mean, what is the difference in it is that all of the behavior that shows up in response to trauma, the coping mechanisms and the way that we deal with the pain is part of what we have to curiously engage with, right? And to explore, where does it come from? What is the root of this? How does it make sense to you? Why is using this making sense to you? And that's for both however people adapt their behavior. Some people adapt it in ways that are transferring their pain out to other people through violence, abuse, manipulation, coercion, and other people adapt through ignoring the pain, through becoming a fixer, a rescuer, or taking care of everybody. And so both of those are about finding out what the root cause of it is, and then moving people through the story of who they are and how of why they are. Like, this is what happened to you, this is how you adapted to it, but it's not who you are. So I think that they are very similar ways of working with people. And as you said, Juan Carlos said, it's also about accountability, meaning that you are 100% responsible for your choices and behavior. And we're supporting you in resolving the trauma means that you become response-able, making different choices around what you do.
Yeah. Thank you, Terry. And I know that Alma Center works very, very closely with Sojourner, the center there for survivors, and all of the programs represented here are very, very, very well regarded in their communities in terms of responses to survivors. So thank you. Another question, Lana?
Yes. There's a couple of questions I'm going to collapse into one question in terms of programming that is focused on the LGBTQ community, young people, women. The question speaks to we keep talking about these programs in a way that is only about men. So what's going on in terms of research or programming for other communities?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Who would like to take that one?
Juan Carlos.
Ethiondo.
And this is Ethiondo. So no, that's a good question. It has been a thorn on the side of researchers forever in the field. And some of the common reasons are justifiable, no? Small groups, small samples, these or that. But really, like many things, they had to do also with the will to do that and to explore the questions. But in preparing for today's remarks for the group, that was not a literature that came out as actively being written about or reviewed in recent years. So that's why it was omitted from my portion.
And I think it's important to mention that even though there's no research about this, there are more and more programs that are actually paying attention to this. There are some excellent programs that work with LGBTQI plus communities, and I think Rebecca put a podcast that we did with the Center for Court Innovation on this topic. There's also more and more programs for women. It's a complex issue because sometimes women present as users of violence when it's in fact they are the victims, or it's in self-defense. So you need some good assessment and safeguard. And I think programs for young people is something that we still are struggling. I know that more people are paying attention to that, but there are very few programs, and I only know one program, STEPS, in New York City that specializes, if you will, that only works with adolescents, both with survivors and people who use violence. Thank you for that, Etienne. I think we have a time for two other questions. We have a hard stop at 4:15 because the wonderful interpreters had to leave at that point.
Well, there's one question about the research in terms of what models and curriculums or ingredients of programs seem to be working well.
It's a big question.
Yeah, in the big reviews, meta-analysis that I looked over, they didn't really necessarily talk too much about that. I did in the study by, let me look at it here. The study by Gunnar Karakurt and her colleagues, the one that evaluated 17 outcome studies, they did not find differences between CBT, use of motivational interviewing, and the standard treatment defined as Duluth. The study by Travers, by Amy Travers, the most recent one, the 2021 study, they did find promising, they call it promising results for, what's it called that? For CBT and for, blanking the name of this, for acceptance and commitment therapy. So they defined them as promising, but they didn't really say much. It was just their view. They were promising. It was more of an opinion than anything else, which is why I omitted it when I said it.
Thank you, Etienne. It seems like there's an edge there where research can grow into to look into what our colleague Tien Ong says are the active ingredients of change, and we are very interested in that. Thank you for that. So one more question before we say goodbye, maybe a non-research question.
Sure. There's a question about how programs can best center survivors.
Okay. Who would like to take that question?
It's,
okay, Jeremy.
It's one of the approaches that actually has, in my view, over the last 25 years of doing this work, it's an area that's fallen off quite a bit. It was the main standard in practice to be aligned. Either you're under a domestic violence program already, or you're aligned with a domestic violence program. And some people had pointed out in the chat, I noticed that they're talking about what's effective. And so abusive partner intervention, battery intervention programs, when they're out on an island and isolated, aren't they're not going to capture that whole accountability piece. You need to be connected with the whole systemic response, because that's where the accountability piece is set in, and that's where the help and resources set in. And then if we don't do our work connected with victims, we don't know what we're doing. We're just going off of what we base our interpretations on. So it's the people who even asking about effectiveness, those are ways to make sure that you're effective if you're connected with an advocate. When I was facilitating groups all the time, women having access, the victims having access to me as a facilitator to question what the guy's going back and telling her was a critical thing for their safety, security, and comfort. And so I think that's something that through CCI and the Resource Center, the APIP Resource Center materials we're developing is pulling some of that back, so people get it in their consciousness again that we need to be connected with survivors and have our victim-centered, trauma-informed work as part of the way that we're organizing and delivering services.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Martini,
Yes.
last word from you.
Yes. I think really quickly, just again, thinking about us as providers being accountable to making sure that we have a holistic view of what we're doing, and recognizing that even though we might be sitting with someone that's using violence, our client isn't just that person, it's also the victim that isn't in the room that we can't always see, and creating opportunities for having that voice in our space. So we just recently had a panel of victim survivors come and speak to all of our staff, so that folks that don't traditionally get to work with victims very often can still have victims' faces and voices to hold in their mind when they're doing their work. We're part of working groups where there's advocates that are present that can check us when we're consulting about cases to make sure that we're, again, holding that lens. And so I think as providers, it's really important for us to make sure that we're creating opportunities for ourselves to hear those voices and to have those stories in our mind when we're working with folks that use violence.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, you have the last word here.
Oh, thank you so much. I couldn't agree with both of them more. And what I would encourage just from a basic level is that survivors and victims need to be in every aspect of your work, not just the advocates, but making sure that they have set the groundwork and continuing responses to the work that you're doing, because it's not just about their quote unquote perpetrator, it's also about ongoing education for BIPs. So just really reiterating what they've said, but just felt like I needed to say it again.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
You're welcome.
Perfect way to end, because we always have the survivors are the forefront.
Right.
So very quickly, some people were asking about the BIP National Network. Pam, you had mentioned it. I think David Garvin probably would be the person to contact, right, for that?
Yes, it would be David Garvin. I know he's on the call.
Okay.
It's D. Garvin. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
I think he already did. David,
okay.
Could you put it in the chat again? David Garvin.
Yeah, please, David. Thank
you
you for your efforts. Well, we're at 4:15. This has been so rich, so incredible. I'm so thankful to all of you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for our congressional sponsors. Thank you for other organizations that co-sponsor this. And thank you for the incredible work of the Futures team. I always say, when something goes as smooth as this went, is an enormous amount of work goes behind it. So thank you to all of the folks that put efforts into this. And so be well, and we'll be in touch, sending more materials and the recording.